My name is Cindy Hamilton, and Sandy and I are co-founders of Opt Out Orlando. We advocate for authentic assessment and against high-stakes testing.
I'm Pesta, and I'm here. I'm from Wisconsin, and I've been in 33 states and talked to 14 different state legislatures about Common Core. And so my unique, I think, perspective is that I've seen in places like South Carolina and Oklahoma, we've given talks there about 6 months ago that helped lead to those states successfully getting out of Common Core. So having been in a lot of states and talked to a lot of different state legislatures, I think my strength probably for you all is that I've seen what other states have done that has worked and hasn't worked and trying to get rid of it.
I'm Karen Effrem. I'm with the Florida Stop Common Core Coalition and Education Liberty Watch. I have been working on education policy at the state and federal level for about 15 years and have been with your help working hard to try and do it in Florida.
My name is Debbie Mayfield, and I'm a House Rep member from Indian River County, and I filed House Bill 25 last year to at least pause Common Core to kind of get it out into the public as to what was going on. And I'm really here to give you a little, answer some questions, but also be here to listen to what you have to say and your ideas of the panel up here on what we can do this next legislative session to really get it out of the state of Florida.
Thank you, guys. Our first question is to Cindy and Sandy. Please give us some basic mechanics for parents for opting out and where they should go for resources.
We have a Facebook organization called Opt Out Orlando, and in the last 6 weeks, we've been able to start opt-out groups in 15 other districts. We also have a WordPress page, which is optoutorlando.wordpress.com. And there you can find information regarding our resources, including directions for how to opt your children out of the high-stakes testing. If you want basic steps, I can give them to you real quick. The first one is have conviction. Know why you're going to opt out your children, because it's not an easy process. People come to us for lots of reasons. They come because the test is written to fail. They come because they want to eliminate federal control over local government. They come because their kids are great students and lousy tests. And then you need to decide which tests you're going to opt out of. If you have specific questions, we can answer those. But the opt-out process is not complicated. It just takes some self-education, and we've provided lots of materials, including a webinar for you to watch so you can understand the process.
I opted out a couple of years ago, my third grader, and that was developing the process. First of all, I would say inform your school. You don't necessarily have to even tell them that you're going to opt out. But if your child is in the third grade and 10th grade are mandatory retention years, which means that if your child does not pass the now Florida state assessment, which used to be the FCAT, they will be retained. There are alternatives that come into play once the child has failed, and those become the loopholes. When you tell your school, I'm opting out, you can expect that they're immediately going to be defensive. They're going to say, there is no opt-out. You can't opt out. The state says you have to take the test. Well, actually, the state law, the state statute actually says that the districts must administer the test. It doesn't say what happens if your child does not take the test. And we've confirmed with the Department of Education that participation also includes the child sitting for the test and refusing the test. So we can go step by step. Is that what you want? Just a simple?
Whatever you want to offer. We do have 1 hour.
Okay. If you want to maybe just clarify for third grade, because that is so important. Because of the mandatory retention, and maybe talk about the portfolio and the alternative assessments that are available and whether they're available before
Right.
you have to take the test and
Right.
are considered failing.
Typically, when a student is identified as being at risk for whatever reason in the class, if the teacher feels that their work is showing that they may be at risk of not passing the test, or if they've taken a pre-test that shows that predicting that they may not pass the test, the child may be identified and letters will come home, usually about December, letting the parent know that their child is at risk, and if they don't pass the test, there may be retention involved, and then they have interventions that come into play. Before that, if you already know that you're going to opt out, what I would suggest is that you inform the school that you would like to request a portfolio from the teacher, and I copy the principal on that as well. And you want to request a teacher-developed portfolio. You're not going to ask just for a portfolio, because some districts, the portfolio that they use is from the Department of Ed, and it's actually a CD, which is really just test questions, just like the FCAT or the FSA. And they are also secret tests, which means that nobody sees the questions. And I believe it's 42 benchmarks that they have to.
The CD contains, the CD contains hundreds of questions and answers. The teacher has to choose 42 passages for the third grader to answer or to read and complete the questions. That's the state-provided CD. We don't want that. That's not a portfolio. A portfolio, by definition, is an example of best work performed in a certain discipline. Teachers in the state of Florida have been doing portfolios for years. And this CD indicates a distrust of teachers, and we trust our teachers. We want the teachers to be putting together this portfolio or example of work.
And it has to be work that is completed independently in classroom. So homework doesn't count, projects done at home doesn't count. It has to be clearly the student's independent work. It's really hard to fail a portfolio. I don't know how a teacher would put together a portfolio that would be failing the student unless the student is clearly not, and if the student clearly needs to be remediated. In that case, then they should be remediated. But if you have good students that just don't test well, they're going to opt out. We'll go through the refusal procedure with you. But the alternatives are, there is an ITBS, which is the Iowa Test of Basic Standards, that has always been used when a student fails, or they use it that's what they used to use before we had FCAT, to see if the kids were doing okay. There's just some of the alternatives, but everything is on our Facebook page and on the blog.
We'll make sure we get that information so you guys have it available, so you can contact these panel members with any additional questions or assistance in what you need to do to opt out. Dr. Pesta, based on your research of the Common Core system, what do you see as one or two of the most practical things a state can do to get out of it?
Well, just to tail end of the question about the opt-out, one thing that I've seen this across the states, the one thing you need to do when you want to opt your kids out is you want to calmly but forcefully let the schools know that you're not asking their permission. They're your kids, right? If you go to the schools with a mindset that you're groveling and you need their help to opt your kids out, you're not going to win that battle. You want to be calm and polite and insistent that I'm informing you of my parental right to opt your kids out. Inevitably, what ends up happening in all the states I've been in is you get three kinds of emails back. If you email your school administrator, one is your kids will take those tests. They will be in the seats. The state requires it. We've told moms and dads send the exact same email a second time. Just, I am opting my kids out of the test. Second email, come on in so we can talk about this. Come on in and let's talk. Send the same email. Third email, well, I vehemently disagree with you, but that's your right. In most states, that works. Obviously, you can learn a lot more from the people who are fighting this battle locally. But in terms of trying to get out of Common Core across the country, the patterns that I've seen worked in places like South Carolina and North Carolina. The single most important thing that keeps us in your schools is the overall lack of parent understanding of what it is. That the only way this gets fixed, it's not, politicians will do, even recalcitrant Republican politicians will do what you want them to do when you make them do it. So if moms and dads aren't paying attention to the issue, and still the vast majority are not, the numbers aren't there. So what you've got to do is, in all these talks I've given, and I know that I think a lot of us would feel the same way, when people know what Common Core is, they intrinsically dislike it for a whole bunch of reasons. I've never given a talk on Common Core that we didn't have a group full of people leaving who suddenly were activists. So I believe firmly that if even 10% of Florida moms and dads knew what this was and fought it, it would go away. That's the one thing that's keeping it. So that's the first thing you got to do. And then once moms and dads become informed and understand that Common Core is the two things that cause us trouble when we talk about Common Core. One is we oversimplify it, or we make it too complicated. So, and this is a cautionary note. If you saw my talk, what's going to happen is there's going to be somebody in the room probably who's going to march into their school on Monday, pigeonhole the third grade teacher, and accuse her of teaching sex to your kids through the national sexuality standards. If you go about it that way, you're going to not have any traction because it's going to come across as hysterical. Simply pointing out all the things, all the tentacles that Common Core has isn't enough. What you need is to be concrete and focused. So when you talk to people and you want to fight this at a state level, you need the kind of presentations that are going to have comprehensive education. In other words, we need to train moms and dads a little bit better in how they go about. And I think that's what other people on the panel can help you about, specifically in Florida. What are the ways we rationally go and get at the core of this for the people who are making this decision? So first and foremost, it's got to be empowering more moms and dads to know what this is. And if you look around here even today, and there's no disrespect intended, but we've got what? For every mom and dad here, how many grandmas and grandpas do we have? Yeah, I didn't mean to out you over there. Y'all look young to me. I'm just saying that in all the talks I've given, it's been about 75% grandparents and 20-25% moms and dads. And until we fix that, because they're the stakeholders, you know how it is, grandma and grandpa. You got limited ability to move your children. You got to get them to things like that. That's the biggest thing you can do. And once you do that, and I know Representative Mayfield knows that, once you get the moms and dads supporting the politicians who are against Common Core, that's when the tidal wave breaks. And it's not surprising. It's states like California, South Carolina, and Oklahoma, and now Louisiana is going by. States with similar characters to yours. States with similar demographics and backgrounds to yours. A lot of rural Floridians, right, who have the same values as the people in South Carolina, people in Oklahoma. So your state's much more likely to get rid of it than mine in Wisconsin, even though we've got arguably the most conservative governor in the state, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled Assembly, and we still can't budget in Wisconsin. That tells you, unless you give the politicians all they can handle on this, by getting moms and dads to work with the ones who know how to do this, that's how you have to go.
Representative Mayfield, this is a little long question, so I apologize. What role do you see as the proper role for the federal government regarding standards and testing, and what would you be willing to do legislatively to assert Florida sovereignty? And these are some examples. Pass a bill putting control of standards and tests in the district and parents' hands, cut ties with No Child Left Behind, lose the waiver, lose the $1 billion of federal funds that Florida receives for this.
Well, I think look, there's no doubt that the problem here is its federal control, as I said earlier. And so we do have to figure out a way to get away from that. And the only way to get away from that is for the state just to say, we're not going to take the money anymore. Now, how do you do that? You know, you just stop taking it, and you quit allowing it in your budget. You know, when we do the education budget, they take into account the $1.5 or $1.6 billion that we get from the federal government. What do we have to do to make sure and ensure that we continue to get it? And that's why they fight every time a parent wants to opt out of an assessment, because the assessment is required to part of the funds to get from the federal government. So, you know, I think legislatively, one thing we do is I agree, we need to empower the parents to be able to opt out without having to jump through 1,000 hoops in order to do so. And, you know, and Dr. Pesta is correct. Parents, or the parents will get intimidated by the school board and the school districts, and you can't do that. You have to stand up to them and say. So in order for us to completely get out of it, we really are going to have to go back to state rights and have legislation that says the state is going to put back control of the education to the school districts. And that's where the control needs to be, is to the school districts and the parents. You know, I don't know, this year we're going to work on bills that are going to do that. And I can specifically see working on bills that allows them to opt out easier than what they currently have to do to opt out and not be intimidated by it. I can see, you know, possibly of ways of giving more control back to the school district and away from the state government. That's going to get us away from not only the federal government, but also the state government mandating what we have to do. So it's not going to be easy, and as Dr. Pesta said, we just have to be chopping away at it, but we have to know the facts, but we also can't get into the weeds. We have to keep above it, above the frail, just to say, here's the thing. We want out of federal funding. We want parents to have more control over what their kids' education is. We want them to opt out of any national assessment, and we want more control back to the school districts when it comes to the curriculum and the decisions that are made on the education of our children.
This question was to Dr. Effrem and Dr. Pesta. Can you speak to the impact of homeschoolers, private schools, faith-based education, and charter schools?
It is a small but mighty force. In Florida, there are 330,000 private school students and about 70,000 homeschool students. And Florida has the largest population of homeschool students in the nation. The groups that work with those students and their families are, we are very proud to have involved in our coalition, and they make a difference because their parents and their circle of influence is upwards of 1 million people. So to mobilize them, you know, would be a really significant force. There are concerns, however, because you have the efforts to align the ACT and the SAT to Common Core. For sure the SAT, because David Coleman said that was going to happen. And I am starting to hear rumors, and I'm working to find documentation, that private schools that receive the Step Up for Students and the McKay scholarships for disabilities are being pressured to take the state tests. The statute clearly allows them to choose another kind of test, but that's not, apparently that's not good enough. But this is still sort of bubbling to the surface, and when I get more solid documentation, we'll be putting this forward. Senator Gates, the Senate President this last session, wanted to require all private school students that got those scholarships to take the state tests, which would be imposing Common Core on the private schools. And there was a large hue and cry, and he backed off, and the House backed off. But there is that effort, even among Republicans and putative conservatives. So it's something that we have to watch. But vouchers are a two-edged sword. If you involve government money, you have to be aware that you're going to get government strings eventually, even if it's not now. And So any voucher bill that requires the state test, like in Louisiana or Indiana, is destructive of the freedom to choose a private school, because it's losing that as an alternative.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, it's even more grave than that, I think. And if I understand the gist of the question correctly, there's also part of the question is, are homeschools endangered by this? In Republican Wisconsin, right, Republicans control all three aspects of the state. The two chief educational officers in charge at the committee level, the two senators and one senator and one assemblyman in charge of education in Wisconsin, the committee, they're both Republicans. They proposed last year in Wisconsin, Senate Bill 286, two Republicans. That bill states that any school in the state of Wisconsin that takes 1 penny of private, state, or any 1 penny of state or federal money, any school that takes 1 penny, will be required to take the national and the state Common Core tests. And if they don't perform satisfactorily, those schools, for 3 consecutive years, the state can take them over. So Republicans have proposed that if a Catholic school in Milwaukee that takes $100,000 a year from the federal government to help feed inner city school kids lunch, that school, simply by taking that money for a lunch program, will have to take the Common Core tests. And if those kids don't perform to the state's satisfaction on those tests for 3 years, the state of Wisconsin will take over a Catholic school. That's proposed by 2 Republicans. It hasn't passed yet. Now it's going to be stalled in the committee, and it's going to come back after the elections in the fall. That's what they want. And she's exactly right, that when people think that school choice is a great option, the problem is that almost all the school choice options are used with federal or state money to some degree. And when you do that, you are in bed with what the state decides to do. So it is a terrible existential threat potentially to things like homeschool. To say nothing of the fact that with the slow transformation, not so slow, of the ACTs and the SATs, it's a kind of, I think, educational terrorism. What you're doing is you're telling schools, you're scaring them by allowing the same man ultimately who oversaw the writing of the standards to now oversee the transformation of the tests. You are basically threatening schools that unless you jump on board now, your kids will not get into college. That is a shocking thing to have done it. And it's happening at the federal level, and nobody seems to want to talk about that. One last thing on this issue I'll throw out there for you. It's already happening in homeschools. There's a woman in Green Bay, and if you're taking notes, please write her name down. It's free. Tina Hollenbeck. Hollenbeck. Tina. She's a homeschool mom. What Tina did in my state, and it's free to all of you, she's personally gone through 2,000 different curricula that's available in this country, 2,000 different curricula. And she's assessed it and labeled it and sorted it based on whether or not it's Common Core aligned, how much, where, and when, and in what ways. 2,000. She's found the 2,000 that she's surveyed, including almost every single homeschool curricula available, about 43% of homeschool curricula are already Common Core aligned. Already. Now that means 57% are not, but 47% are aligned. And I understand why the publishers are doing this. Do you want to have to hustle into schools and try to convince teachers to adopt and go to all the homeschool conventions and try to sell your wares with everybody else selling with their wares? Or do you just want to align it to what the feds are doing, knowing full well that there's always going to be federal money to help support programs that are getting on board? So not all homeschools have gone, we're still less than 50%, but unless we're promoting and utilizing the homeschool curricula that are not Common Core aligned, that market will dry up as well. So it's already beginning to happen there. So if you go to Tina Holland, type in her name, it's free of charge. You can look at everything that's in your school, and you'll have a better sense too of, you may be using homeschool materials right now, and you're unaware of the fact that they're Common Core. I'll throw this last little nugget out. Ultra-conservative Bob Jones University Press, right, considered to be the right-wing gold standard for homeschooling, they've already advertised Common Core compliance. They've already advertised, on their website, we have an actual screenshot of Bob Jones University Press having a seminar, a webinar for teachers who want to incorporate Common Core into the homeschooling classroom. Now, when we talk to them directly, they disavow that, but I've got the screenshots of them advertising it. So they tell homeschool moms and dads one thing, but their own advertisements belie what they said. So you have to be very careful, and the fact that this is already beginning to infiltrate this way shows, I think, that ultimately this is a long-term existential threat to not just private schooling, but homeschooling as well.
This question is for all of the panel. We're often accused of coming up with problems but no solutions. You want to get rid of Common Core. What are you going to replace it with? You want to get rid of these high-stakes testing. What do you replace it with? Please answer the question to start down here.
The high-stakes tests right now, we believe, do not help teachers to inform their instruction, first of all. That's what a test is supposed to do. When they say it's diagnostic, it isn't. It's not telling the teacher anything about the kid except giving them a number, which they don't actually get until just about the end of the school year. So there's no chance for the teacher to do anything with that test. All of these tests are really only there to assign numbers to the student and to the teacher. And a lot of these numbers are giving a grade to the teacher in the school, and that determines the teacher's ability to renew their contracts, because Florida is now a right-to-work state. Teachers have no tenure. Most teachers are on an annual contract basis. So a teacher this year doesn't know necessarily that their contract is going to be renewed next year. So you can see the pressure that comes to bear on teachers to get the students to pass these tests. And that is where all of the teaching to the test comes from. If we get rid of all of the state-mandated tests that do not inform instruction in the classroom in any way, what are they going to do? There's nothing for them to use against the teachers. So, and it also helps the students, because then the teachers will be able to really teach. That's just my.
Teachers and school districts all know about good testing, testing that does inform instruction, testing that will allow a teacher to understand where the student's at on that day and where they need to go before the end of the year. If we eliminated the high-stakes tests that we use right now, which are FCAT and the FSA, teachers can tell us exactly what we need to do. We don't need to come up with the wheel for them. They already know the answer to this. So.
Yeah, I think you're going to hear the same answer in some form all the way down the line here, but I think it's good that we all get the chance to say it in different ways. Yeah, you got to get rid of the high-stakes testing, but even if you get rid of that, who put the high-stakes testing in? It's the federal government. It's the federal government. Too much federal intrusion. That's one thing that you can do and that you're going to have to do. Even if you get rid of the high-stakes testing at the national level, then I guarantee you the educational administration in your state will just take them and make the same tests at the state level. And as I tried to show in my presentation, there's not the slightest bit of evidence that state standards have any more immediate impact in the classroom than federal ones do. So you got to get the feds out of it. And you've got to instill a mindset that, as you just both said, nobody knows better what your kids need than the teacher who's dealing with those kids. Let the local schools, it's not that complicated, right? As Josh Katz said, this is not rocket science, this is not complicated. If you've got teachers that you trust, right, give them basic literacy goals. Okay, by third grade they need to be reading at this level. It's easy when you, and you know what's so beautiful about that? Is that gives you a genuine mechanism that you don't have now to get rid of teachers who clearly aren't doing it. Right now, the good teachers and the bad teachers, you can't even really tell, because the standard dictates what they do anyway. And I remember when I was learning how to teach, I was told over and over again that if all you're doing is teaching kids to pass particular tests, you are engaging in something that's terribly unethical. You are not imparting knowledge, you are just basically cheating with kids to get to a certain particular test or set of test questions. Get back beyond that, and it's not just enough to turn it over to the state. That may be the first round of things. But if you're going to have meaningful parental and meaningful teacher involvement in this, let the standards be no more broad than even a district or even an individual school, or heck, even a middle school, right? Have standards in local schools for kids from first grade through fifth grade, and make sure the only job the school district should have is to make sure that the assessments that the schools are using on the interior are fair and relatively equitable. Let that work itself out, and you're going to watch how quickly education turns around, and how we can identify those kids who really need help, and we can let the ones who succeed go off on their own way and not be artificially held back. So there's a couple steps involved, but it's going to have to come back to the classroom's going to have to matter again.
Absolutely. We have had state control of standards and tests since 1994. And that was a federal mandate that came about from actually an international agreement that happened in 1990 under George H.W. Bush. Then it was put in as Goals 2000 School to Work, the Workforce Investment Act, and the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now called No Child Left Behind, but used to be called the Improving America Schools Act. That was the first time that the federal government really started stepping in it as far as requiring statewide standards and tests. And as Dr. Pesta has eloquently pointed out, it's done nothing. We've spent $2 trillion on the federal level, and achievement scores have been stagnant or falling, and the achievement gap between white students and minority students, or between middle class and poor, has stayed the same. It's not changed at all. So we definitely need to go back to pre-1994 policy and put it back at the local level, not even the state. Oklahoma is the best bill so far that's passed, but it's still requiring state standards. It's still requiring state tests. It tried to comply with the arcane, bizarre rules of the No Child Left Behind waiver, and they still got their waiver yanked. So we need to be willing to give up the federal money. Frankly, we need to do what Senator Rand Paul said and defund the entire Department of Education at the federal level. We need a state to be willing to stand up and say no to the federal money and go back to the local level. And then a lot of this would sort itself out.
Yeah, you know, I agree with what everyone said, but you know, I want you to listen to what we're saying. It's the federal requirements, it's the state requirement. It's not their children, it's our children. And we're not being involved in the process of what our children are being taught or what our children are being tested on. And that's where the problem is. That's where we have to get it back to the local level so that we can be engaged. You know, to me, you need standards, but the standards should be your child needs to read by third grade level. By third grade, they need to read on a third grade level. Now, teacher and school district, you go figure out how you want that to happen. And parents will be engaged, and teachers will feel like they are really doing their job, and that is to teach to that child's need. Math, you need to know your multiplications up to 20 by a certain grade. That's a standard. And if you need to know algebra by a certain grade, that's a standard. But those are things that should be done locally with your school district, with your community, with your business community, and with your parents. They are the ones that can do it best. You know, to me, a child is learning if they're coming into, let's say, third grade, and you do a simple test. This is what we want you to know before you leave this classroom. Very simple. And you have them take the test. At the end of the third grade, you give the same test, and you say, and you let the kids take it and see how much they have learned. But you're not teaching to the test, you're teaching them on ways of what they need to know, because it's pretty much generic, a lot of things on what they need to know. So I don't like the teaching to the test, but that's what we have gotten to whenever we come out with a national assessment and national test and state test, because you're teaching to the test, because that's what the teachers are going to get paid on, that's what the students are going to be graduated on, and so people are focused on more of the testing than they are the actual learning of life learning experiences that they need to know while they're in school. So, you know, I agree, we have to get away from this, and the one way to get away from it is to stop taking the federal money and for school districts to stand up for what is their right on what they were elected to do. Do you know school board members are elected, and they're elected because you're supposed to be listening to the people in their community, just like we are supposed to be listening to the people within our district and our state. Board of Education people are not elected, they are appointed. So, you know, one of the things that we could start taking a look at is how our Board of Education is done. Maybe we need to look at them being elected, so they'll start listening to the people whose children are being affected by everything that they do. So, you know, the one thing that I keep telling people is to remember, not keep it the big picture, is the fact that they're your children. They're not the government's children. They're not the chamber children. They're not the, you know, the federal government. They're your children, and you need to really just fight for it. And that would be one way of doing it, is getting back to the local school district and electing people that will fight for you in Tallahassee to make sure they're doing their job.
And we got a quick question, another question, but kind of real quick piggyback, just a very quick piggyback on that. Two things. This idea that who your kids belong to, all this tying into the United Nations, the UNESCO stuff. Does anybody know what the United Nations, UNESCO's initial motto was when they first founded at the UN? Your kids are our kids.
Yeah.
Right? This attitude to, this is a big war over who controls your kids. That's the first thing. Second thing I just wanted to say, the doctor reminded me of this. You remember during the last presidential election when we had 5 candidates on the Republican side? Mm-hmm. You had Gingrich and Santorum. I remember the first debate that they were all together. Every single one of them said the first thing they'd do if they became president of the United States was eliminate the Department of Education. We went from 5 candidates to 1, and it was never mentioned again. When the one Republican, and I think it would have been true if any of those Republicans had become the nominee. Once we got 1, it never was even mentioned on the campaign trail again. Right? So this idea, right? And Rand Paul's right. We've got to have serious candidates that are willing to, perhaps more than any single thing that we can do nationally, is you get rid of the Department of Education, it's going to be so much easier to do everything we've said here. And that bureaucracy, it swallows up so much money and so much control. You get rid of that, and we've got to the point where our politicians know we want to hear it. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we've had one who's serious about doing it.
And I would just say, Senator Paul has actually filed a bill. He's been clear on following through with what he said. A, and B, the state constitution, Article 9, Section 4B, says that elected school boards are responsible for what happens within the free public schools of their districts. Not the state board appointed, not the legislature primarily, and certainly not the federal government.
The Florida Department of Education states that the Florida legislature does not legislate academic standards. Please define how Florida can repeal Common Core if it has not been legislated.
They need the governor, therefore, can act now and say, we don't want these standards, and get rid of an appointed board. And the other way is to pass legislation that has been proposed, that has passed in Oklahoma, it's been proposed in Minnesota, and passed both chambers of the legislature, but was not signed into law by Mark Dayton, to require legislative review of the standards. That is one option. However, that does bring in a lot of political considerations that may make that hard, but I would rather make it hard for the state to control the standards anyway. So if they all die while everybody's arguing about them, that's fine.
But couldn't you say this, and you tell me if I'm wrong about it.
Gotcha.
I just wanted to say though, but isn't it true, and maybe you tell me you know the state of Florida better, but isn't it true though that the legislature can't control the purse strings? And if the legislature pulls the money, cuts off the federal trough, I guarantee you, 80% of the people who support this suddenly are going to have a come to Jesus moment with regard to the standards, right? But and am I wrong? Can the legislature do that?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. We do control the purse strings, and that's how you're going to fix this, is to stop funding and taking the federal money. Now, this is true. The legislature's process was not to approve the standards, and that's where I go back to the Board of Education. The Board of Education has way too much authority and way too much power not to be an elected official. They are an appointed position. And that all came about, this all came about whenever the Constitution was changed and we eliminated a Commissioner of Education being elected. He was appointed by the governor. And once that happened, there was rules put into legislation that went through the process of how those Board of Governors are going to be appointed and who appointed them and what their power was. Now, we wrote that. We can change it by taking away the power of the Board of Education. But that's how you have to change it. So you either have to change the Constitution that says that we are no longer going to have an appointed Board of Education. We're going to have either an elected Commissioner of Education, or we're going to change the way the Board of Education is appointed and make those elected positions within the region of the state, if that's what we want to do. I would just assume eliminate them, just like the federal government, DOE, and let it go back to the local school district and let the local school districts tell us what it is that their needs are and what their funding ability or their funding needs are, as well as what they're seeing in their district that they need. That's where we need to change all of this. But it is with the purse strings, and that's how you change it.
House Bill 25, can you tell us what's in it?
House Bill 25 is the bill that I filed, and it was to allow public hearings amongst the state, and we were going to have, I think it was 26 or 32 public hearings to have the input of the parents and the teachers on the effect of the Common Core standards that were being implemented into our classrooms. It also required us to pull out a part, which we did. We did have, the governor's orders did require 3 public hearings, but not the 26 public hearings that I put in my bill, because the 3 public hearings to me wasn't enough. When we did redistricting, we did more than 3 public hearings throughout the state of Florida to do redistricting, and we should have done the same thing when we did the public hearings for Common Core. But those were the 2 major things, and to do an analysis as to what this was costing us to change. That was my biggest concern. We keep saying, and they keep telling us, these were 90% Florida standards already. So why is everyone so upset about it? Well, if it was 90% already, then why was this big push in implementation of 3 years to get the teachers up to speed on how to administer those standards? And that's because they're not standards, they are a curriculum, and it was a method of teaching that is being taught to the students, or to teachers were learning in order to teach it to the students. But those were the things that was in my bill, was the analysis on what it's costing us to do that. But the bill was more of a pause, let's take a look at it, let's bring awareness. Just like Dr. Pesta said, parents need to be aware of it. And no one knew anything about this until this past year when it was showing up in their classrooms. The parents were seeing it in their kids' work. That's when it became aware as to what was going on. And you had these Parents Against Common Core, you had Florida Stop Common Core. That's when we were aware.
Is that bill tabled?
That bill was never heard.
Let me get to the next question, and we've got several of these on the same note, is basically, what do you want us to begin doing legislatively? How do we go about getting rid of this? How do you want us to support you in Tallahassee?
We are having discussions with Representative Mayfield and several other legislators that are expressing interest in repeal bills. And we're starting to talk about the different elements, the different things that need to be done. You know, Oklahoma-style repeal with a statewide replacement. We're less and less enamored with that idea because in Oklahoma, in Indiana, And I think in North Carolina, they're already rebranding and just giving the same thing. So that's a problem. Plus, the federal government is putting down its hammer. So we will discuss the state sovereignty, giving up the federal money, and the local control. In addition, maybe defunding, maybe, and then obviously some data protection. And me as a pediatrician, I'm really interested in a prohibition on psychological testing. In that. So these discussions are ongoing. As soon as we get something more formed, we will absolutely get it out and start asking for grassroots support. In the meantime, though, even before a bill, we have got to put pressure on the governor before the election. We have got to do that, because if all he can offer now is a review commission when his election is ostensibly in danger, what is he going to do when he doesn't have the pressure of re-election? Probably not very much. So that, you're going to be hearing very soon about that. And then we're also reviewing legal challenges, and we're going to be working with board members. There are many that are elected, that advanced or are running, or that won, to support them and to say, okay, you're afraid of loss of federal and state funding, so maybe instead you can just tell parents what's already legal. The third grade portfolio, the alternative tests at 10th grade, the Algebra 1 EOC alternatives, the things that were on the sheet that we passed out earlier today. Boards can tell their parents now that those things are legal. And so the county isn't opting out, but the parents then can make an informed decision about whether they want to opt out. And really, there is nothing, and there's even documentation from one of the school districts and the state that if a child refuses it, it gets coded as what's called NR2, and it doesn't even count for accountability. It doesn't count. So the teachers and the districts aren't going to get in trouble. We need to inform the board members and the parents, and they need to take their stand that way.
And Karen's right, but the key thing is though is get with your school board members and let them know what they can do, because a lot of them don't know what they can do because they're being told by the administrator at the school district what they can do. So I would encourage you to get with the school board members and let them know that. And you need to get with your legislative House member, whoever your House member is, your representative for your district or your county, and your senator, and just tell them, look, we know Common Core is not standards, it is a curriculum. We don't like what we're seeing. I know there's going to be legislation coming through this session, and we really want you to support and get engaged in it. And tell them that you want them to be educated on it. We can't go out there with, wacko stuff saying, you got to know your facts, because as soon as you say something that, that they're going to go, wow, that's crazy. That's how they're going to view it. It's crazy. But there's so much facts that is real, we don't need the other at all. So just be engaged, tell your House members, more so get with your school board members, because that's where the fight is going to have to come, is at the school board level back up to us in order to make this happen.
One of the things that we really stress in the opt-out movement is to help your school board representation understand what they can do immediately. They don't know what they can do. They've been telling parents and community members for years that all the blame belongs in Tallahassee. And we have been holding them accountable. If you are not the power, you need to become the power, because they are our first line of defense. And it's very simple. There is something called a progression plan. Every district has a progression plan, and they can make 3 major changes to those progression plans immediately. It is their choice if they don't do it. They can make teacher developed portfolio an acceptable alternative assessment in 3rd grade. They can make sure that students are never progressed to honors classes based on only 1 test score, that students are evaluated based on a whole child. And they can make sure parents understand and have a grip on what it means to use alternative assessment for graduation requirements in 10th grade. Those are things your school board members have to be held accountable for right now.
We are out of time, but I have to do this. I have 2 things here that I want to mention. One of them is, how do we fund our schools if we opt out of Common Core? And the other one is, has anyone thought about doing educational opportunities for our legislators and our school boards? Get together people to educate them as to what's going on. And quickly as quickly as you can, because I'm out of time.
Well, while they're putting that together, I would simply say, for this question and for the last one, just know who you're talking to in terms of educating people. You are not going to change the mind of a superintendent of schools, because they have too much pressure from above to implement this. Yep. There are some people you can't educate. I know you've gotten a lot of great information and you're going to want to share that with people. Share it with your school boards. Share it with their legislatures. Try to educate them. The school administration, you're not going to educate them. They're not going to take you seriously because you don't have education degrees. Those are the people for whom you simply must register your disapproval. That's the one thing that didn't get said. One thing you can do immediately now is, even if you don't get a chance to explain it, or even if you don't get a chance to talk to them or show them your slides or whatever, you register as much discontent with them as possible. Let them know, I'm not going to waste your time in sitting in your office lecturing you for 15 minutes, but I want you to know, as a parent with 2 kids in your school system, I strongly oppose Common Core, and I vehemently want you to try to get us out of it. Let people know. Educate the ones that are educatable. Let the others who aren't, and that's mostly the school officials, let them know you disagree strongly, and keep working on the people that can help get their minds right.
Yeah, you know, the funding, the money coming from the federal government is a small percentage of the total education budget. The education budget is the 2nd largest part of our budget. You have Health and Human Services is the largest, then it's education. And so the 1.5 billion or so that we're getting from the federal government, by the time if the Board of Education and the school district didn't have to do all the monitoring and the following up and the accountability back to the state, or the accountability of the state back to the federal government, there's a cost savings right there in itself. So when you're talking about cutting that out of the budget, you know, it's 1.5 billion is a lot of money to me, but when you got a $77 billion budget, it's not that much. And you can, again, it goes back to prioritizing. We have to prioritize all the time on our budget. So it's a matter of prioritizing where that money's going to be coming from. And I would tell you that there certainly has got to be a cost savings in just eliminating the involvement with the federal government in itself.
That $1.5 billion is 6% of the entire education budget for the state of Florida, just to put it into perspective.
Guys, I would love to have read and asked every single question that I got, but I really had to focus on what we could do to work this through. I am already into the next hour, and I apologize for that, but I really feel like this was very informative and very helpful as far as reaching across and getting some information out to you. I think that there is going to be a workshop going on from 2 to 4, led by Dr. Effrem, basically continuing this discussion, but that will be taking place in the cafeteria, and we are going to need to set up for our next speaker. So let's give them a hand, and thank you so much for